The Shibuya incident arc has forced many of our main characters to step up to the plate, and in one of the best episodes of the series thus far, Choso was able to show just how powerful he was in his fight against Yuji. And in the efforts to take down Dagon, Megumi showed just how useful he could be in a fight, even when going up against a powerful special grade curse. In this video, I'll be pitting these two characters against one another, Megumi versus Choso, the 10 Shadows versus Blood Manipulation, the Zenin clan's Precious Technique versus the cherished inherited abilities of the Kamo clan. These two will be going at it in this video, and I'll be breaking down their physical abilities, curse technique, intelligence, and overall combat prowess in order to see who would win and why. Starting off with Choso, I think it's pretty fair to say that his fight with Yuji, specifically the anime version of it, did a really good job of showing the difference in ability between the two. I would definitely consider their battle a high diff one, considering that Choso was willing to risk losing his arm in order to beat him, but it's still quite obvious that from the jump, Choso had the advantage in just about every sense of the word. From a distance, he was able to keep control of the battlefield with Convergence and Piercing Blood. In mid-range, he could use Slicing Exorcism, Blood Edge, Supernova, or many other different forms of blood manipulation, and when fighting up close, Flowing Red Scale Stack gave him the physical boost needed to keep up with a beast like Yuji. In videos like these, I typically like to go over a character's physical scaling and hacks separately if possible, but in the case of Choso and Megumi, they are both so intricately linked to their techniques and the way that they fight that removing either of them from the character in order to isolate a particular aspect of their scaling doesn't make too much sense. In Choso's case specifically, blood manipulation actually allows him to amplify his physical strength, speed, and endurance by essentially blood doping, and this puts him on even footing with Yuji. Now, technically speaking, he needed to combine Flowing Red Scale Stack with the hardened blood on his arm to guard against Yuji's strikes, but even before doing this, it's clear that amping himself with his own technique was enough to generally help him keep up with Itadori. Regardless, when he's using a technique like this, he scales directly to a pretty great close quarters combatant. This isn't all though, because when it comes to strength and speed, Flowing Red Scale Stack isn't even his best option. That honor goes to Piercing Blood, which is fast enough to put Yuji on the back foot entirely while this ability is in play, and strong enough to rip through his arm or just about any part of his body if Yuji isn't able to entirely avoid it. Technically speaking, Yuji can react to it at multiple times throughout this fight, especially when looking at the manga's depiction of it, but the implication throughout the fight is that it's an extremely risky thing to try to avoid, and blocking it is simply not an option, even for a tank like Yuji. In terms of tanking attacks himself, Choso honestly isn't that powerful when he's not covering parts of his body with hardened blood. I say this because it's made clear in the anime and manga that Yuji was only able to land 3 clean hits during their entire fight, yet Choso had still taken quite a significant amount of damage from just those few hits. For a sense of scale, Yuji was able to land 5 black flashes on Hanami, not 5 regular attacks, 5 black flashes that are exponentially stronger than his base attacks, and the tree cursed spirit was still able to continue fighting and even had enough cursed energy and fortitude to open a domain expansion. This doesn't make Choso's base form weak or fragile per se, but he certainly is much more vulnerable than Hanami and brittle enough to be hurt by characters of Yuji's caliber, significantly so even. This completely changes when the blood armor is in play, however. With this, he's able to completely tank a full power strike from Yuji without trouble. It honestly wouldn't be crazy to say that he's temporarily able to boost his durability beyond that of Hanami's when this particular technique is active, simply due to the fact that Yuji is able to hurt Hanami with his basic punches, but Choso seems completely unfazed from an attack of similar strength and intent. One other effect of Choso's blood that's particularly useful against most sorcerers in the series is the poisonous effect that it has on all those who it hits. Now, Choso's toxic blood seems to be a bit more lenient than Eso and Kejizu's, at least in terms of activating and affecting a character in the first place, considering that it only seems to take effect if the poison actually gets into the opponent's body, rather than simply making contact with them, as we see in a later fight that takes place in the manga. With just these 2 blood manipulation techniques though, Choso becomes a fighter that could force your average sorcerer into an early grave, but his ability to constantly recycle splattered blood on his opponents to blind them and form a variety of blood constructs makes things even more dicey than they already seem. In the anime especially, we see that Choso is willing to get extremely creative with the usage of his technique, creating Wolverine-like claws and manipulating the stream of his piercing blood with great effect. Supernova is another named attack from Choso that could be used against opponents to catch them off guard and sneak in some damage. So while this technique may seem simple conceptually, Choso has exhibited a very obvious creativity and competency with it that was enough to make Yuji resolve to throw his life away in an attempt to defeat him. Now, I know that this technique is really strong, and Mechamaru seems to think that it essentially has no weaknesses, but this isn't entirely true, especially when considering Choso's relative inexperience as a fighter. We know that water making contact with his blood stops him from controlling it outside of his body for long stretches of time, which eliminates convergence in piercing blood from being a viable option. Another weakness, or rather a condition for piercing blood in the first place, is the charge time required to launch a fully powered and high speed beam like he does against Yuji. It doesn't take an egregiously long time by any means, but a cool-headed sorcerer fast enough to take advantage of this charge time could definitely make use of this gap in attacks. And the final thing that somewhat holds Choso back is his inexperience in combat. Now, it's not quite clear how this impacts his fighting ability specifically, considering that Choso was out there fighting Yuji like he's been doing it for decades, but in moments of confusion or complexity, it's likely that Choso's lack of battle experience may result in him taking more damage than necessary, or simply making decisions based on impulse or emotion. In spite of all of these minor drawbacks, Choso is still an absolute monster to go up against from a close and from afar, so it's time to dive into Megumi scaling to see if he has anything in his bag that can contend with the special grade Cursed Womb. Megumi Fushiguro is very similar to Choso in the sense that his curse technique is so connected to a style of fighting that scaling him without the technique in mind is basically a fruitless endeavor. You could say this for most characters in the story for sure, but for these two especially, I'd argue that they are so crafty and unique with their curse techniques that they are able to make up for any deficiencies that they may have in raw stats. Physically speaking, Megumi on his own is relatively impressive all things considered. He's shown himself capable of fighting alongside Maki against Hanami and Goodwill, and later with Yuji against Awasaka after awakening part of his potential in his fight with the Finger Bearer. This level of scaling is important because it means that at the bare minimum, Megumi should be able to avoid attacks with the same level of efficiency as Yuji, if not more so when you consider his Shikigami aiding him in battle. Megumi's usage of the 10 shadows is extremely sly, and oftentimes is able to get him out of situations that would otherwise be unavoidable if he didn't have that curse technique. Even before his domain awakening, we see that Divine Dog's implied to be both faster and stronger than him, gaining some level of praise from Hanami in terms of speed, and being able to visibly damage them with their claws. Its defensive capabilities become more obvious when you see Divine Dog save Megumi from getting pummeled by the Finger Bearer's initial rush, essentially guaranteeing that he can summon a Shikigami from the shadows and narrowly avoid some lethal attacks that he physically wouldn't be able to without his technique. Rapid Escape and his Toad Shikigami have also been shown to help him get out of dodge, with the former breaking his opponent's line of sight, giving him a moment to actually catch his breath and regroup, and the latter being quick enough to pull him away from the attacks of a physical beast like Toji Zenin. When his concentration is at its peak, and he's guaranteed that Toji will attack in a linear fashion, Megumi is even able to physically react to Toji's charge himself and deploy a shadow to mess up his footing, as well as make contact with him. Now, am I saying that Megumi is relative to Toji in combat speed? No, that'd be a bit ridiculous. Megumi himself says that he can barely keep track of him with his eyes, but it's impressive in its own right that he's able to avoid someone this powerful on 3 separate occasions, especially when you consider the fact that he is extremely drained of cursed energy. His ability to do this speaks more so to the versatility of his technique and the flexibility of his mind than the physical speed and reaction time that he has. Now, don't get it twisted, his speed and reactionary abilities are very impressive and are going to be integral to him performing well against Choso. However, I'd like to highlight that just like the Blood Manipulator, Megumi's 10 Shadows curse technique is a large majority of what makes him a capable fighter. Unfortunately, his attack potency isn't as impressive as his curse technique and speed is. He scales well below the likes of Shibuya Arc Yuji when just looking at what exactly he can do with his own fists and curse tool. He's technically able to keep the Finger Bearer Curse Spirit at bay with his physical attacks, kicking it and punching it around, but the real damage comes in, once again, via the 10 Shadows. Divine Dog is honestly his heaviest hitter when it comes to being an offensive and defensive threat, as it's able to hurt Hanami, one-shot a Finger Bearer, and just generally demonstrate some pretty impressive scaling in this department. Max Elephant being dropped on someone's head is likely to deal some serious damage depending on your strength, and a stunning ability can be useful to set up for combination attacks, although in terms of stopping power alone, there isn't all that much to speak of. If it wasn't clear already, I'd argue that Megumi's most useful traits are his intelligence and curse technique. The 10 Shadows curse technique is actually extremely similar in nature to Blood Manipulation, specifically in the sense that it allows users of this ability to fight at many different ranges and utilize a number of strategies to keep opponents guessing. While Megumi may not be the best fighter in a 1v1 situation, he's almost never fighting like that, using the shadows to alter your footing, Nue to shock and stun you, Divine Dog to slash and help him avoid lethal attacks, Rapid Escape Snape to obscure your vision, the Toad to restrict your movement, and Max Elephant to douse you in water or simply crush you under its immense weight. The game of cat and mouse that Megumi can play with his opponents at any given time is extremely difficult to deal with, and I'd argue that he's just as malleable in combat as Choso is with blood manipulation. His intelligence and experience would also contribute immensely against Choso. The fact that he's fought a blood manipulator before and seen exactly what the build-up for piercing blood looks like and what follows might just be one of his biggest advantages over Yuji in the exact same situation, and his ability to combat Choso immediately by dousing him in water with Max Elephant gives him a great way to limit his opponent's options. Just like Choso though, Megumi isn't the perfect combatant despite his battle IQ and elite curse technique. For one, he simply doesn't have Yuji's overwhelming durability and tenacity. Megumi's no pushover, in fact, no sorcerer in the series really is in that department, but holy shit is Yuji a demon when it comes to fighting through injuries, and against someone like Choso, that's going to be an imperative skill to have, which Megumi unfortunately doesn't possess. Another problem that could crop up as the fight goes on is Megumi running low on cursed energy reserves. Now, he's typically not the type of character to gas out quickly unless he opens a domain expansion, but in order to fight Choso, he'd literally have to be performing at peak efficiency for the entire battle, and over time I could see this really tiring him out. Now, one of the weaknesses that I was going to list on here is a lack of poison resistance for him. You see, the only reason Choso versus Yuji doesn't end in the span of 5 seconds is because Yuji has a resistance to poisons and toxins. Without this resistance, he'd be overwhelmed by the toxic effects of Choso's blood, turning that piercing blood into both the first and last attack that he'd ever withstand. Megumi doesn't have the benefit of having the same poison resistance statement as Yuji, but he is able to do something that implies a level of resistance to it in the first place. Now, you can skip to this time code in order to avoid major manga spoilers if you're an anime only, but just know that for the sake of this video, I'll be going over Megumi with poison resistance against Choso as a potential route for this fight to go. For manga fans, you might be aware of where this is going. If not, buckle up. In chapter 61, it stated that Yuji has a tolerance for all poisons because he is a suitable vessel for Sukuna. Now, it's possible to interpret this statement in one of two ways. The first way, and the way that I know a lot of people will, is thinking that this means that Yuji develops a resistance to poison because of Sukuna. However, the second option, and the one that I personally more align with, actually lines up with a statement we have earlier on this series, where Megumi's thought process in the beginning of the story implies that one must already be resistant to the poison that is Sukuna's presence in the first place if they hope not to die. In this panel here, he calls Sukuna 1, a special grade cursed object, and 2, a poison. This implication leads me to believe that if you can ingest one of Sukuna's fingers and not immediately die, you likely have an extremely high tolerance for all forms of cursed energy related poison and toxins. As we now know, Megumi is also able to be a vessel for Sukuna without dying, meaning that he should have a resistance to poisons innately, not just after being a vessel, but beforehand. This is a pretty big thing to have revealed in the background if my reasoning is correct, and it'd also do wonders in helping his performance against Choso. We'll consider both possibilities since Megumi being completely resistant isn't as confirmed objectively as it is with Yuji, but there's enough evidence in the text to reasonably justify my line of thinking in this regard, at least enough to entertain the possibility. Now, combining all of the positive and negative traits Megumi has within his incomplete domain, and you have a character that is honestly just around the proper level of strength to fight Choso and cook up an interesting battle. All that leaves us to do now is discuss the battle, how these two characters and their techniques would interact, and in the end, decide who would win between Megumi and Choso. The title of this video may lead some to believe that I think either Megumi or Choso body the other relatively easily and one-sidedly, and while that was certainly my stance when giving a knee-jerk reaction to the topic, in the process of making this, I realized just how complex things could get depending on the variables, so let me lay a couple of them out for you. The first two variables are the most important to deciding the outcome of the fight, so I think those are the two that we're going to really focus in on when talking about the conclusion. Variable number 1. Can Megumi avoid piercing blood with his speed feats, Shikigami, and prior knowledge on blood manipulation? A large percentage of this fight's outcome is predicated on this answer. Variable number 2. Is Megumi resistant to poisons, or does one wrong move spell defeat for Fushiguro? I think this one is self-evident, but Choso's blood being toxic to Megumi versus it not entirely changes the outcome of their bout. In tackling the first variable, you realize that it's honestly quite hard to say one way or another, at least with 100% certainty. On one hand, even Yuji wasn't able to completely avoid piercing blood on a consistent basis, and he's just about as fast as Megumi should be. In the worst case scenario, Choso starts off with a piercing blood attack, catching Megumi off guard, and severely injuring him from the very start of the fight. fight. On the other hand, Megumi is aware of what piercing blood is, at least in a basic sense, what takes place before he can fire it off, and on top of that, he has Shikigami that he can deploy to assist him in avoiding the attack. If he's able to do it with moderate success against Toji, it's not really insane to say that he'd be able to pull off something similar against Choso. His prior experience, solid reaction feats, and extra help all make me lean towards the idea that Megumi would be able to avoid piercing blood as an opening move, and potentially even press Choso enough to make compressing his blood an impossibility, or at least something that is significantly more difficult. It's not something I'm willing to say happens with 100% certainty though. It's definitely the more likely outcome in my mind. But if Choso were to catch Megumi off guard with that attack in the same way as Yuji, Megumi takes some serious damage to his arm, and that could hamper his ability to make the hand signs that allow him to summon the Shikigami. Depending on just this variable alone, Megumi is either able to continue this battle at basically 100% or be handicapped from the start. This leads us to our second variable, the one that holds Fushigero's poison resistance in the balance. To be completely blunt, if Megumi has no resistance to Choso's blood, he's simply going to lose this fight, likely performing worse than Yuji did. The speed at which Choso's poison affects the opponent is too quick, and arguing that Megumi fights Choso somehow without getting injured by his technique even once is a bit too absurd to argue in good faith. Pairing the worst case scenario for both variables guarantees a victory for Choso. The piercing blood would damage whatever part of Megumi it hit, and the poison would do the rest. Even with being extremely charitable to Megumi under these conditions, the best thing that he could do is avoid piercing blood a few times, shuffle through his Shikigami and attack Choso a bit before getting hit with Supernova, the Wolverine Claws, Blood Edge, or some other form of attack. He's certainly not weak, but Choso's blood being poisonous is just too high of a wall for him to climb if he actually is not able to resist it in any capacity. However, if you are like me and think that Megumi does have the proper tools to avoid Choso's attacks and is resistant to poisons due to the aforementioned reasoning, this one-sided bloodbath becomes a very, very interesting debate now. I think it's likely that Fushiguro can clear these conditions based on all of the scaling and reasoning provided, but that doesn't make this an easy fight for him by any means. The next intelligent step for Megumi would be to douse Choso in water via Max Elephant in order to put a stop to piercing blood completely. Even if Megumi is capable of dodging that attack consistently, it would honestly inhibit his ability to counterattack and would probably tire him out before he can hurt Choso for real, meaning that unless he gets piercing blood off the board, Megumi is still only going to prolong the inevitable. Even still, assuming that Max Elephant does hit Choso and it does catch him off guard because he doesn't know that water makes him weaker, we see in the anime particularly that Choso is an elite fighter with enhanced blood limbs, flowing red scale stack, and temporary external blood constructs. Would follow a hypothetical no piercing blood in convergence fight between the two is some of the coolest choreography that the series could have. Choso on his own would certainly be faster and stronger, but Megumi would be able to offset a lot of this disparity by using his Shikigami. Divine Dog, Nue, Rabbit Escape, Max Elephant, all of these creatures would be shuffled through at high speeds and be a massive contributor to his decent performance against Choso, and honestly think this fight would probably become one that is decided by whoever develops the better strategy. If Choso is able to find a way to land one clean, unguarded hit to Megumi with his reinforced arm, it's likely that he'll either die on the spot or be incapacitated to the point of being unable to fight otherwise. Knowing this, Megumi would have to really be on the defensive. In his case, the win con isn't just hitting Choso once, he actually doesn't have the advantage of being that strong. The win con for him is getting an opening to hit Choso with a strong enough attack to put him on the ground for good. His own attacks wouldn't be able to do so, Nue's wouldn't, and Max Elephant probably wouldn't either, leaving Divine Dog or a domain expansion as his only finishing move. The environment they fight in could certainly limit or extend Megumi's options as well. If he and Choso are fighting in a very open environment, he's going to have to travel to a confined area in order to trap him within his domain and make sure that he remains in range. Otherwise, it'd simply be a waste of cursed energy and time for him. If they're already in a space that suits a domain expansion opening, then he can pop it whenever and basically catch Choso completely off guard. Otherwise, he'd have to somehow bait him into following him, which shouldn't be all that hard considering how obviously Choso cares about his brother's reputations and his hot-blooded attitude making him lose sight of strategy in moments like that. Using a similar tactic to the one he used with his first domain expansion, Divine Dog should probably be able to put Choso down. Honestly, due to Choso's durability and due to Megumi's ability to have Divine Dog hurt Hanami, I don't think Choso is going to just tank an off-guard backstab from him, very similar to the Finger Bearer. And honestly, I don't think it's entirely infeasible for Megumi to pull off or even come up with this strategy either. It's just going to be extremely difficult no matter how well it goes. He's going to be taking significant damage. He's going to be getting hit with attacks that would probably force him to go well beyond his limits, but I do think it's possible for him to pull off a win despite this. Now, I can already see the comments as I say all of this, but I want to make it explicitly clear that I think Megumi's potential to win is predicated on many conclusions that, while well-founded in the source material and linear logic, are somewhat antithetical to the discourse surrounding Megumi and Choso as individual characters. Despite this, even in the best of cases, if these two were to fight 10 times, I'd personally only bet on Megumi winning 6 tops. I love to say that Megumi and Choso probably lose as often as they win, just due to the nigh infinite ways in which this battle could go, but something tells me that you all would find the fence sitting to be a bit unsatisfying in this instance. So if I have to choose a victor, I'd take Megumi just barely over Choso here. There are definitely realities where Choso sees through Megumi's line of thinking and defends against Divine Dog's sneak attack, or even avoids the Water of Max Elephant earlier in the fight. But when I compare these two characters and the conclusion of the fight comes down to hacks and strategy, I can't help but put my stocks just a little bit more in Megumi's favor. He's consistently shown himself to be more intelligent, more experienced, and just a little bit craftier when it comes to dealing with characters significantly stronger than him. It's not unreasonable to think the blood manipulating Curse Womb could win, because his performance against Yuji in the anime is honestly quite scary to put Megumi up against, but at the end of the day, all of the evidence I've gathered and arguments I've laid out leads to this conclusion. Feel free to yell at me in the comments, subscribe for more videos like this, and check out this playlist if you're interested in more versus battles of this nature. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.